The other thing that I want to emphasize is kind of the moral development takes a bit longer. And sometimes that's the part that we struggle with. You know, we want young people to do the right thing just because. But when we're kind of thinking about moral development, I mean, we as humans, I mean, our first moral development is really about we do the right thing to not get in trouble, right? Because it's been kind of programmed in, we have a society around us that tells us that's, you know, that's wrong, that's bad, if you do this, if you do that. For the most part, I mean, there's kind of these, you know, humanistic kind of pieces or altruistic pieces that occasionally you'll see. But for the most part, kids do the right thing because they want to stay out of trouble. And then we learn to do the right thing because it feels good, right? You know, when we do it and we see someone that's really appreciative, or we can see that we've helped somebody, and that gives us this warm feeling, which arguably is not altruistic. Does that make sense? Because we're getting something out of it. That highest level of kind of moral response is when we do the right thing, even though it makes us feel bad, or it puts us in danger, or it threatens our life, right? Going that step, which is hard. I mean, hard even just standing in a grocery store, you know, standing up for someone that's, you know, being kind of harassed, or putting your life on the line for someone in Vegas. I mean, you know, I'm saying those situations of doing the right thing even though it's bad for you, right? And so, but when we see young people, I mean, we're expecting them to be at this do the right thing, definitely because it's bad, you know, because it's the right thing to do, even if it's you think it's bad. But they're really still at the do the right thing in order to avoid getting in trouble, right? They're not even at the do the right thing because it feels good stage. And so understand that about the teenage brain. And then they also just, you know, they're still not thinking much in the future. And it's not just kids that are in the juvenile justice system. You know, we have kids all the time in our systems that say, I don't expect to live past 18 or 20. But even those that have these full, rich lives and so much opportunity, they're not thinking what it's going to be like at 20, 21, or even 23, because that's old. I mean, to them, that's, you know, it's so understand that that's the case. So I love this kind of diagram. I want to kind of highlight it for you. This is from Lawrence Steinberg. And what this highlights is this solid line is what we call intellectual ability. So their smartness, if you want to call it that, right? And so if you look at kind of the progression of intellectual ability, so it steadily increases and kind of plateaus at 16 or 17. Not that it doesn't continue to grow, but you really have this kind of sharp incline. And then they're really pretty smart at 16 or 17, intellectually. And I mean problem solving in abstract situations, you know, that are unemotional, things like that. But look at what we call the psychosocial maturity, this dotted line. Look where it kind of runs from the age of 10 to the age of about 21 in regards to psychosocial maturity. Does this surprise anybody? What's scary is this difference right here between how smart they are and how emotionally ready they are, right? Because they see the world, you know, they see the inconsistencies, they can understand kind of the language and the rules and all that kind of stuff, but are they ready to hear it, right? Are they ready to kind of understand it and invest it? And this is kind of the greatest challenge. And then, like we talked about, at about 25, that kind of all gels together. It kind of all makes sense. Yes, sir?
Is that chemical or is that society? Because you're talking about school age.
Right.
And then essentially they're leaving school, the learning pattern, the intelligence kind of plateaus, but the maturity goes up.
Right, and that's an excellent question. He's asking, is that chemical or is that societal? And some would argue it is societal, that back in the day, but you also had your life expectancy was shorter, right? But you had increased responsibilities earlier. So it may have been a similar thing, a difference, but at 10 instead of, you know, 25. But that is a valid question. We just don't have the data to kind of verify this. I mean, this is, you know, doing intellectual testing and then doing psychosocial maturity. But he has a very valid question. What part of this is biologic and the way kind of we've developed as humans over time? But some will argue that humans evolve based on their society and then it kind of becomes biologic, almost in a way. So, but what we do see is that the brain functions differently. Now, the reason that the brain functions differently may be because of how much we've trained the brain or how much experience the brain has had. And so that's kind of a very valid question. Okay, so one thing I want to highlight in regards to brain functioning is there are many factors that influence this. You asked kind of what impacts, why are some adults still kind of in this way? So for children, though, there's still things that impact brain functioning. One is sleep. And I know I brought sleep up earlier, and I know it seems really trivial in a way, but sleep is huge in regards to brain development and brain functioning overall. And oftentimes we will see kids that look like they're struggling with executive functioning, and it is solely because they are sleep deprived. Because what is the average bedtime for kids these days? Which means their screens are truly off and they're asleep in bed. Right, 1 in the morning kind of is what I see, especially if you're talking like 12, 13, 14. So screens are off and they're actually asleep. But those kids are still waking up to go to school, and I know they're trying to delay school times, but they're still, 8:30, 8:15, 8 o'clock. If they're having to ride the bus, you get into 7:30, 7 o'clock. So you have a kid going to bed at 1 or 2, waking up at 6, 7-ish. They're functioning on, 4 or 5 hours of sleep. So let's talk about you, right? There's always a few in a group. Who does well on 4 or 5 hours of sleep day in and day out? I can see that in you. I know him. It all comes together now. He actually does do well on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. You probably feel groggy if you sleep longer than that. Yeah. So, but for the rest of us, if you slept only 4 or 5 hours day in and day out, how would that affect your problem solving, your impulse control, right? Your attention, your ability to attend. So think about what kind of, and if you think about those pruning stages, if you think about those growth spurts, kind of how that all kind of interplays, right? How am I going to practice and develop those skills that could make me more psychosocial mature at an earlier age if I am, sleep deprived? And I'm not talking sleep deprived, where like in the, torture sense, but truly sleep deprived into where I'm maximizing my potential. What about eating habits for our kids? I saw an oh my gosh. So eating habits. Back there is a wonderful, display of kind of really good, tasty food. So we joke, and I thought it was just a San Antonio thing, that it was either hot Cheetos or Takis and some sort of like big Red or Mountain Dew or Red Bull or Monster. But that is actually national, that diet. It may not be hot Takis, but it'll be some other kind of corn chip with artificial flavoring. Beg your pardon? Right. Yeah, it's just everywhere around. I mean, it's something. There's, some kind of buffalo chip, or depending, no matter where you're at, coast to coast. It's some sort of corn chip with artificial hot seasoning and then an energy drink. Like I said, it used to be more of a soda, but now it's more Red Bull, that kind of thing. And so what if that was your diet day in and day out? Right? And do you think for the young people, they stop eating this stuff at 5? Like, do I stop my Red Bulls at 5? No, they're having their last Monster at 10 o'clock at night or 11. So how does that impact sleep, right? So again, if you're doing that day in and day out, how does that affect your ability to problem solve, to tolerate frustration, to kind of attend to situations? So think about that. So, and then there's the issue of undiagnosed medical issues. And I bring this up, this is about mental health issues, but this is also about just general brain functioning. They did a study where they looked at every child that was referred to a community-based mental health clinic. A lot like Clarity, right? The outpatient side of Clarity. So any child, it wasn't Clarity, I want to clarify that, but any child that walked through the doors of this community mental health, and typically it was, the school said they should go, or maybe the family was worried about them, but they came for a mental health issue, no other reason. In that study, they found that 30% of those kids had an undiagnosed medical issue. Undiagnosed, but a medical issue that was contributing to their symptoms. They had chronic ear infections. They had abscessed teeth, beginning stages of diabetes, Other types of infections, STI infections, untreated, think about how that would impact you. I mean, if you had any kind of infection, I don't want to know what kind of infection, but any kind of an infection, if it wasn't being treated, how would that impact your ability to problem solve? Think about a chronic ear infection, to pay attention. And a lot of our kids just sit with that physical discomfort. They don't talk about it, or they seem whiny, or they seem irritable, but we're not really picking up, and they don't pick up, that it's a medical issue. And especially oftentimes the children that we work with in the community, how many of those kids get regular medical care? And think about those time periods and when that happens in that developmental stage and how that impacts brain development. All right. So there's also kind of more, not these day-to-day minor things, but there's some things that truly influence brain development. Obviously, brain injury. And, we're doing a lot as a society to focus on head injuries and athletics. What's the #1 sport for head and neck injuries? Cheerleading. Okay, yes, cheerleading is a sport. Just want to defend that. No, I'm just teasing. But I mean, if you think about oftentimes the tumbling that's involved, the pyramids, all of that kind of stuff, they're some of the greatest for shoulder, head, and neck injuries. So, there's an interesting study where they looked at an adult prison system that was substance use focused prison system, and they looked at the inmates in that prison system, and 70% of those inmates had a traumatic brain injury. 70%. And we're like, well, yeah, these are crooks, they're criminals. I'm sure they were running away from law enforcement, all these kinds of things. 70% had brain injuries that occurred during early childhood. So prior to criminal conduct. Not that it's, they had the head injury and then became a criminal. They may have been a highly impulsive child who, jumped off roofs or, rode their bike off a ramp. That wasn't a wise idea. I'm not saying that there's a causal effect, but 70% had brain injuries in early childhood prior to any delinquent conduct. So the other thing that we see is traumatic experiences, and I cannot emphasize this enough in regards to how trauma impacts brain development. And I'm sure you guys are, very focused on, trauma focused in regards to the work, but if you think about how the brain works, right? What happens in regards to emotional development happening first, remember, bottom up, inside out, then cognitive control. Think about when the trauma impacts them and how they're learning those pathways, whether those connections are being made, and what connections are being made, right? What are their social relationships like in regards to their expectation for adults, their expectation for nurturing, their expectation that they can excel or succeed? How does that impact them, right? How does that impact the physiological development in regards to always being on point or stressed, right? And I think I kind of jumped out of line, but you'll see those in the kind of future slides in regards to it impacts them at multiple levels in regards to trauma. And substance use is obviously huge, both substance use of the caregiver, right? Not in utero, mom's substance use is really key. We don't have a really good way to say, oh yeah, you can tell where in the brain was affected because the mom smoked weed, right? It's not that pure of a science because it's more affecting those connections. And it may affect some connections and not others. This kid may be super smart still, right? But they can't emotionally regulate, or it might be the opposite. There's not been any kind of science that said this child was clearly influenced. Unlike what we see in regards to fetal alcohol, in regards to, there's these physical symptoms you can tell, right? But actually that's not the case also. There's some kids that have kind of more of a subtle kind of impact in regards to that. And then mental illness. So if a child, which 1 in 5 children struggle with a mental health issue, right? If that child then has to navigate the world and go through all those things in regards to emotional center of your brain developing and then the cognitive center of your brain, but you're struggling with being able to regulate your behavior, regulate your mood, how are you going to learn solutions? If you're just learning to contain yourself, if you're just learning how to not be so depressed that you want to kill yourself, which we are seeing at a younger and younger age. I'm part of a coalition that's addressing teen suicide prevention, and we are seeing an increase in suicide attempts and deaths by suicide in the past 3 to 4 years. If they're managing all of that emotion, how are they going to learn how to resolve those day-to-day things like how to get to school if I'm late, right? Those pathways aren't being built because they're focusing on kind of just not self-injuring, right? Or not being aggressive with my brother. So it creates challenges later on in life, even if now their mental health is managed. If those pathways for daily coping haven't been developed, then they are kind of at greater risk for some executive functioning issues. So how can you build resiliency? How can you help build kind of executive functioning? And for the young people that you work with, for the young people in your life, helping them get exposed to healthy relationships is key. They do a lot of research on what treatment modalities are effective. When you talk to young people, what they're going to reference when they say, I've come out of this darkness, whatever that is, mental health, kind of struggles in life, and it's because of X, this person, right? It's a relationship that's key to them. Now, there may be some treatment modalities that kind of impacted or helped that person be more powerful, but they remember the relationship. And it doesn't have to be a long-term relationship. It doesn't have to be someone that's with them from birth. It can be this little blip in time, right? But what they remember most is that person cared about me, but also that they cared about me realistically. Not that they thought I was the best, that I would be president of the United States, that they knew my strengths and weaknesses, right? And they were honest about those. That's what's key. So having kids get exposed to positive activities, when we're talking about the brain and all of those kind of possible connections, that's not just about learning how to solve problems. It's being exposed to different cultures, different foods, different music, different ways to move your body. All of those things, the more the brain lights up, the better, right? Because then it will make connections that we don't even kind of realize or see. So it's giving kids the opportunity, whether that's in person or whether that's through exposure to things, even on a TV or in a book, right? Letting them see different parts of the world and different types of people is a wonderful opportunity. Assertiveness training, everyone laughs at that. How does that build resiliency or kind of help with this? It's really helping them learn that there are multiple ways to stand up for themselves, right? A lot of the kids that we work with, they only know a few ways. And one of them involves saying F you of some kind, or running out of the room, or shutting down, right? And so it's helping them learn that they can stand up for themselves. And if they feel empowered, then it opens up all these other pathways that they can kind of develop. Problem-solving skill development, I'll talk about that more in a second. And ideas about self-efficacy. And I use self-efficacy very intentionally, right? I don't use the word self-esteem, because this is about a child knowing that they're effective, that they have things that they can do, right? And they know the things that they are not good at doing. You've got to do both, right? Because you don't want some child beating his head against a wall trying to do something that's really not in his wheelhouse, right? And will never be in his wheelhouse. Not that a 5'2" kid cannot play in the NBA, but it's kind of like, let's find out, if that's what you want to do is to be a part of that world, yes, continue with your basketball skills, but what other ways can you be a part of that world, right? And there's a ton of ways, that would probably make more money and keep their brain safer. Not so much NBA, but okay.